Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're covering 15 cold cases that were finally solved using DNA and genetic genealogy, some after more than 50 years. These are stories about victims who were never forgotten, families who never gave up hope, and the incredible science that finally delivered justice. Case 1. Esther Gonzalez, 45 years in the snow. On the morning of February 9th, 1979, 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez left her modest home in Banning, California, for what should have been a simple walk to her sister's house. The day was cold, with patches of snow still covering the ground from recent winter storms that had swept through the San Gorgonio Pass area. Esther pulled on a warm jacket, kissed her mother goodbye, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. She never reached her destination. Esther was the youngest daughter in a large, close-knit Mexican-American family that had lived in Banning for generations. Her parents had worked hard their entire lives to provide for their children, instilling in them values of faith, family, and hard work. Esther embodied those values. She was a bright student at Banning High School, known for her infectious smile and kind heart. Teachers described her as conscientious and eager to learn, always raising her hand in class, always willing to help other students who struggled with assignments. Her older sister Elizabeth, who went by Liz, was Esther's closest confidant. Despite being several years older, Liz and Esther had maintained a bond that transcended typical sibling relationships. They talked daily, shared secrets, dreamed together about their futures. Liz had gotten married the year before and moved into a small house just a few miles from the family home. Esther loved visiting, playing with her young nephew, helping Liz with household chores, while they chatted about boys, school, and what life might hold for them. That February morning, Esther had called Liz the night before to say she'd come by around noon to help babysit. It was a routine they had established. Esther would walk over on weekends when she didn't have school, spending time with her nephew while Liz caught up on errands or simply rested. The walk was only about 3 miles, a straight shot down the main road that connected their two neighborhoods. Esther had made the walk dozens of times before, without incident. When noon came and went with no sign of Esther, Liz wasn't immediately worried. Maybe she had gotten held up at home. Maybe she'd decided to stop somewhere along the way. But when 1 p.m. passed, then 2 p.m., and still no Esther, Liz called the family home. Their mother answered, confused. Esther had left hours ago. She should have arrived long before. The family immediately began searching. Liz's husband drove the route Esther would have taken, looking for any sign of her. Other family members fanned out through the neighborhood, calling her name, checking with friends, growing more frantic with each passing hour. By evening, when Esther still hadn't been found, they called the Banning Police Department to report her missing. The police response was typical for 1979. A 17-year-old hadn't come home. She was probably with a boyfriend, probably staying with a friend, probably would show up sheepish and embarrassed in a day or two. But Esther's family knew better. This wasn't like her. She was responsible, she called. If she was going to be late, she would never worry her mother this way. Something was terribly wrong. The next morning, February 10th, 1979, a motorist driving along Highway 243 in the mountains above Banning spotted what looked like a pile of clothing lying in the snow about 30 feet off the roadside. Something about it looked odd, out of place. The motorist slowed down, then stopped, then walked closer to investigate. What he found made his blood run cold. It wasn't a pile of clothing. It was a body. A young woman, partially clothed, lying face up in the snow. She had been dead for hours, her body stiffening in the freezing temperatures. The motorist ran back to his car and drove to the nearest phone to call police. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies responded to the scene, along with investigators from multiple agencies. What they found was a brutal crime scene. The victim, later identified as Esther Gonzalez through her clothing and physical description, had been sexually assaulted, then bludgeoned to death with a large rock that was found nearby, covered in blood. The violence of the attack was shocking even to seasoned investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was rage, brutality, evil manifested in physical form. The crime scene told a story that investigators would piece together over the following days and weeks. Esther had been walking along the road toward her sister's house when someone had stopped, offered her a ride, perhaps claimed they knew her family or were heading in the same direction. Esther, trusting and kind-hearted, had accepted. Instead of taking her to her sister's house, the driver had headed up into the mountains on Highway 243, a winding two-lane road that climbed into the San Bernardino National Forest. At some point, the driver had stopped at the remote location where Esther's body was found. What happened next was too terrible to fully contemplate. The assault, the violence, the moments when Esther must have realized she was going to die. The killer had used a rock from the roadside to beat her to death, then left her body in the snow and drove away, leaving no witnesses, no evidence beyond what was at the scene. The Gonzalez family was devastated. Liz blamed herself. If only she had offered to pick Esther up. If only she had called earlier when Esther didn't show up. If only. Their mother was inconsolable, unable to understand how something so evil could happen to her youngest daughter, her baby, a girl who had never hurt anyone in her life. The family held a funeral that was attended by hundreds of people from their community, all mourning the loss of a bright young life snuffed out senselessly. The investigation moved forward with all available resources. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Esther, trying to determine if she had mentioned anyone suspicious, if she'd been afraid of someone, if there were any clues in the days leading up to her death. They found nothing. Esther hadn't mentioned any problems, hadn't seemed worried about anything beyond normal teenage concerns about grades and friends. Investigators also looked at the location where her body was found. Highway 243 wasn't a major thoroughfare. It was mostly used by locals who knew the area. People heading up to the mountain communities of Idlewild and Pine Cove. Whoever had taken Esther there either lived in the area or knew it well enough to know where to find a remote spot to commit murder. Physical evidence was collected from the crime scene. Fibers from Esther's clothing, samples from her body that the killer had left behind during the sexual assault, the rock used to kill her. In 1979, DNA testing didn't exist. The best investigators could do was preserve the evidence and hope that someday technology would advance enough to make use of it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The leads dried up. The tips stopped coming. Esther Gonzalez's murder became another unsolved case in the Riverside County Sheriff's files. Another family left without answers. Another killer who had gotten away with murder. Liz Gonzalez never stopped grieving for her little sister. She married, had more children, grew older, but the pain never fully healed. Every February, on the anniversary of Esther's death, Liz would visit the cemetery, lay flowers on her sister's grave, and pray for justice that seemed like it would never come. The case sat cold for decades. Detectives would occasionally pull the files, review them, hope to find something new. But there was nothing new to find. The evidence existed, but without a suspect to compare it to, it was useless. Then, in the early 2000s, DNA technology began to revolutionize criminal investigations. Old cases that had seemed impossible to solve were suddenly being cracked open using genetic evidence. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department began looking at its cold cases with new eyes, wondering which ones might benefit from DNA testing. Esther Gonzalez's case was an obvious candidate. The physical evidence had been carefully preserved in 1979, stored properly, maintained through the decades. If there was DNA from the killer in that evidence, modern technology might be able to extract it and create a profile. In 2020, the Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team made Esther's case a priority. They sent the evidence to a specialized forensic laboratory that dealt with old, degraded DNA samples. The lab worked for months, using cutting-edge techniques to extract whatever genetic material remained after more than 40 years. The results came back positive. There was DNA. It belonged to the killer, and it was of sufficient quality to create a genetic profile. But when that profile was run through CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, there were no matches. The killer had never been arrested for another crime. Or if he had, it was before DNA collection became standard practice. The investigation had hit another wall. But this time, there was a new tool available: forensic genetic genealogy. This technique, which had gained national attention after solving the Golden State Killer case in 2018, used DNA to build family trees by comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in public genealogy databases. It was a painstaking process that combined traditional detective work with genetic science. But it had proven remarkably effective at identifying suspects in cold cases. The Riverside County team uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GED Match, a public genealogy database where people upload their own DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. The profile didn't match anyone exactly, but it showed connections to several distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the killer somewhere in the past. A forensic genealogist began the meticulous work of building family trees from these distant matches. She traced ancestry back generations, then forward through multiple family lines, trying to identify which descendant could have been in Banning, California, in 1979. It took months of work, cross-referencing historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death records, newspaper archives. Slowly, a name began to emerge: Louis Randy Williamson. Williamson had been born in 1958 in California. He had lived in the Riverside County area in the late 1970s, including in and around Banning. He had a documented history of violence, arrests for assault, domestic violence, threats, and most significantly, he had left California shortly after February 1979, moving first to Arizona, then to Florida, where he lived for the remainder of his life under various names and identities. Investigators began building a case. They verified that Williamson had been in Banning in February 1979. DMV records showed he had a California driver's license with a Banning address. They found people who remembered him from that time period, who described him as angry, violent, someone with a hair-trigger temper and a history of mistreating women. They built a timeline that placed him in the area at the time of Esther's murder. Then they got the crucial piece. Williamson had died in 2014 in Florida. But before his death, he had been arrested one final time for a minor offense, and a blood sample had been taken. That sample was still preserved in Florida's evidence system. Riverside County investigators obtained a court order to access that blood sample. It was sent to the same lab that had tested the evidence from Esther's murder. The DNA was extracted and compared. It was a match, Louis Randy Williamson's DNA matched the DNA from Esther Gonzalez's murder with a probability so high that it was essentially certain he was the killer. On November 14, 2024, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department held a press conference to announce that after 45 years, Esther Gonzalez's murder had been solved. Sheriff Chad Bianco stood at a podium, flanked by the detectives and forensic genealogists who had worked the case. Behind them were photos of Esther, smiling, vibrant, forever 17. Today we can finally give the Gonzalez family the answers they've been waiting for, Sheriff Bianco said. Esther was murdered by Louis Randy Williamson on February 9, 1979. He took her life, and then he ran. He lived another 35 years before he died, never being held accountable for what he did. But today, we're telling the world who he was and what he did. Esther's name will be remembered. His name will be remembered too, as a murderer. Liz Gonzalez, now in her 60s, attended the press conference with other family members. She wept as she spoke to reporters afterward. "I've waited 45 years for this day," she said, her voice breaking. "Esther was my baby sister. She was kind and trusting and good. And that monster took her from us. I wish he were still alive so he could face justice. I wish he could have gone to prison and felt even a fraction of the pain our family has felt. But at least now we know. At least now the whole world knows what he did." The resolution of Esther Gonzalez's case made headlines across California and the nation. It became a symbol of how modern forensic genealogy could reach back across decades to solve cases that had seemed impossible. It gave hope to other families waiting for answers in their own cold cases. For the Gonzalez family, the emotions were complex. There was relief, finally knowing who had killed Esther, finally having confirmation that the investigation hadn't simply given up, finally being able to tell Esther's story in full. But there was also frustration and anger that Williamson had escaped earthly justice, that he had lived for another 35 years after killing Esther, that he had died peacefully instead of facing trial and punishment. In the weeks following the announcement, Liz and her family held a memorial service for Esther at the cemetery where she was buried. They invited the detectives and genealogists who had solved the case. They shared stories about Esther, the funny moments, the happy times, the dreams she'd had for her future. They thanked God that the truth had finally come to light. Liz stood at her sister's grave, her hand resting on the headstone that bore Esther's name and the dates of her too short life. "You can rest now," she whispered. "Everyone knows the truth. Everyone knows you didn't just disappear. Everyone knows someone evil took you from us. And everyone knows his name now, too. Rest in peace, baby sister." Esther Gonzalez's case was officially closed on November 14, 2024. 45 years, 9 months, and 5 days after her murder. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. The truth had finally come to light, pulled from the past by science and determination, and the refusal to give up on a 17-year-old girl who deserved so much more than to die in the snow on a February morning. Case 2. Nancy Anderson, the Christmas visitor who never left. Hawaii, 1972. Nancy Anderson was 19 years old and full of restless energy when she decided that Arvada, Colorado, wasn't big enough for her dreams. It was 1971, and Nancy, the fourth child in a family of 10 kids from Bay City, Michigan, wanted adventure, excitement, something more than the ordinary life her siblings seemed content to build in suburban Colorado after their father's death had prompted the family's move west earlier that year. She was a little unrestful and wanted to do something adventurous. Her sister Betty Burke would recall decades later, still able to picture Nancy's infectious smile and boundless enthusiasm. She would walk into a room, and people would gravitate towards her like a magnet. She was that kind of person. You wanted to be around her. In October 1971, Nancy made a decision that both thrilled and terrified her family. She was moving to Honolulu. Hawaii seemed impossibly far away to her 9 siblings, an exotic paradise that existed more in imagination than reality for a working-class family from the Midwest. But Nancy was determined. She found a roommate, scraped together enough money for a one-way plane ticket, and set off for the island paradise where she believed her real life would begin. The early months in Honolulu were everything Nancy had hoped for. She found work, made friends, spent her days off at the beach soaking up the sun and the culture of island life. She wrote letters home describing luau's and surfing lessons, the smell of plumeria flowers, and the taste of fresh pineapple. Her siblings could hear the happiness in her words, the sense that she had finally found the place where she belonged. But when Nancy called home in late November 1971 to say she was coming back to Colorado for Christmas, something in her voice gave her sister Betty pause. Nancy sounded off somehow. Not unhappy exactly, but nervous, on edge, looking over her shoulder even through the telephone line. Nancy arrived in Arvada on December 22nd, carrying a small suitcase and a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The family gathered for Christmas, all 10 siblings trying to cram into their mother's modest house, sharing stories and laughter and the kind of chaotic joy that only large families can create. But Betty noticed that Nancy seemed distracted, jumpy, constantly checking the windows as if expecting to see someone outside. One evening during that Christmas visit, as Betty and Nancy sat together after the younger kids had gone to bed, Betty asked her sister directly what was wrong. Nancy's answer chilled her to the bone. She acted a little strange, Betty remembered. She thought something was going to happen to her. I think Nancy was afraid of something or someone. But when pressed for details, Nancy clammed up. She wouldn't say who or what she feared, wouldn't explain why she thought something bad was going to happen. Maybe she didn't fully understand her own intuition. Maybe she thought she was being paranoid. Or maybe she knew exactly who the danger was, but couldn't bring herself to admit it out loud. After New Year's, Nancy flew back to Honolulu, back to the apartment she shared with a roommate at 2222 Aloha Drive, in the heart of Waikiki. The building was a modest low-rise, nothing fancy, populated mostly by young people trying to make it in paradise on limited budgets. Nancy's apartment was on the 2nd floor, accessed by an exterior staircase that made coming and going easy, but also made security somewhat questionable. On January 6, 1972, Nancy went about what seemed like an ordinary evening. She made dinner, chatted with her roommate about plans for the weekend, maybe watched some television before heading to bed. Her roommate said goodnight and went to her own room. Everything seemed normal, routine, safe. The next morning, January 7, 1972, Nancy's roommate woke up and got ready for work. She knocked on Nancy's door to see if she wanted coffee, but there was no answer. Assuming Nancy was sleeping in, the roommate left for work. But something nagged at her throughout the day. Nancy's door had been slightly ajar, which was unusual. Nancy always kept her door closed. When the roommate returned home that afternoon, Nancy's door was still open. She called out Nancy's name as she approached, but silence answered back. She pushed the door wider and stepped into the room. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. Nancy Anderson lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Her body was covered in wounds, dozens and dozens of stab wounds that had been inflicted with savage, almost frenzied brutality. The violence of the attack was overwhelming, the kind of murder that speaks of rage and hatred beyond normal human comprehension. The roommate screamed and ran from the apartment, banging on neighbors' doors, begging someone to call the police. Within minutes, sirens filled the air as Honolulu Police Department units converged on the quiet residential street. Detectives and forensic technicians poured into the apartment, beginning the grim work of processing a murder scene. The medical examiner's report would later document the full extent of Nancy's injuries: 63 separate and distinct wounds. She had been stabbed over and over and over again, with a knife that the killer had likely brought with them, as no murder weapon was found at the scene. The attack had been sustained and vicious, suggesting someone who knew Nancy, someone who had a personal reason to want her dead, or someone who had completely lost control. Crime scene investigators found crucial evidence that would end up solving the case nearly 5 decades later. 3 towels in the apartment, one of them blood-stained and lying near Nancy's body. The towel had soaked up blood from the attack, and forensic testing would eventually show that it contained DNA from 2 people: Nancy's blood and the blood of someone else. The killer had apparently cut himself during the frenzied attack, his own blood mixing with his victims on that ordinary bathroom towel. In 1972, DNA analysis didn't exist. The towel was collected as evidence, properly preserved, and stored away as investigators pursued other leads. They interviewed Nancy's friends, her co-workers, people in her apartment building. They looked into her life in Colorado before she moved to Hawaii, searching for anyone who might have followed her to the islands. They investigated her roommate thoroughly, looking for any sign of conflict or motive. But every lead dried up. Every tip went nowhere. Nancy's family, devastated by her brutal murder, could only watch helplessly as the investigation stalled and then went cold. They buried Nancy in Colorado, the sister and daughter who had wanted adventure and found only death. Her gravestone marked her as Nancy Jean Anderson, 1952-1972. A life of just 19 years cut short by senseless violence. For Nancy's 9 siblings, the grief was compounded by the lack of answers. Who had killed their sister? The police had no suspects, no arrests, nothing. Had it been a random attack, some stranger who broke into her apartment? Or had it been someone Nancy knew? Someone she might have feared during that strange Christmas visit when she kept looking over her shoulder. Decades passed. Nancy's siblings grew older, had children and grandchildren of their own. But they never forgot their sister, and they never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, her killer would be identified. They called the Honolulu Police Department periodically over the years, asking if there were any updates on the case. The answer was always the same. They were still working on it, but there was nothing new to report. Then, in the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology created new possibilities. The Honolulu Police Department established its own accredited DNA laboratory, one of only a handful of police departments in the country with that capability. Cold case investigators began looking at old evidence with fresh eyes, wondering what might be possible with modern science. Nancy's case was an obvious candidate for DNA testing. The blood-stained towel had been carefully preserved for decades, stored in proper conditions that prevented degradation. In the mid-2000s, investigators had the blood evidence tested, extracting a DNA profile from the unknown male contributor, the killer who had cut himself during the attack. The profile was run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contains DNA samples from convicted offenders across the country. No match. The killer had never been arrested for another crime, or if he had, it was before DNA collection became standard practice in the criminal justice system. The case hit another dead end, but this time investigators knew they had something valuable: a complete DNA profile of the killer. They just needed to figure out how to identify whose DNA it was. In 2019, Nancy's brother Jack Anderson reached out to someone who had become famous in cold case circles: C.C. Moore, a forensic genealogist with Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. Moore had helped solve numerous cold cases using investigative genetic genealogy, including the infamous Golden State Killer case in California. Jack Anderson had read about her work and wondered if she could help solve his sister's murder. Moore was immediately interested. Nancy's case had everything needed for a successful genetic genealogy investigation: a complete DNA profile from the killer, evidence that had been properly preserved, and a determined family willing to see the case through. She agreed to take on the case. The Honolulu Police Department officially asked Moore to get involved in 2019, providing her with the unknown male DNA profile from the crime scene. Moore uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases like GED Match, looking for distant relatives of the killer who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to explore their ancestry. The profile didn't match anyone directly, but it showed connections to several distant relatives, people who shared small segments of DNA with the killer, indicating they had common ancestors somewhere in the past. Moore began the painstaking work of building family trees from these distant matches. There were actually two places the DNA was going back to in Italy: southern Italy, more central, then Sicily, and then other trees were going back to Romania. Moore explained. The killer had ancestry from both Italy and Romania, which narrowed the search considerably. Moore then tried something innovative. "I just decided to try something new and go through the Honolulu City Directory from the time Nancy was murdered and look for people who had Italian last names or Romanian last names. She was looking for someone who had been living in Honolulu in 1972 and who might have Italian or Romanian heritage based on their surname. One name caught her attention: Tudor Cirila. The name was distinctly Romanian, and city directories from 1972 showed that a Tudor Cirila had been living in Waikiki at that time. In fact, he had lived in the same building as Nancy Anderson, just a few apartments away. Moore dug deeper into Cirila's background. He had been a graduate teaching assistant at the University of Hawaii in the early 1970s, studying and working while living in that modest apartment building on Aloha Drive. After Nancy's murder, he had left Hawaii, eventually settling in Reno, Nevada, where he had built a seemingly respectable career, even serving as a deputy attorney general for the state of Nevada. But Moore also discovered something troubling in Cirila's past. He had once been arrested for kidnapping a girlfriend who was trying to break up with him. The charges had been dropped, but it showed a pattern of violence toward women, a history of not taking no for an answer. Armed with this information, Honolulu Police Department investigators obtained a search warrant to collect DNA from Cirila, who was now 77 years old and living in Reno. Officers approached him at his apartment, explained they were investigating a cold case, and collected a DNA sample via cheek swab. The sample was sent to the lab for analysis and comparison with the DNA from Nancy's crime scene. The results came back definitive. It was a match. After 50 years, Nancy Anderson's killer had finally been identified. Tudor Cirila, the neighbor who had lived just down the hallway, had murdered Nancy in her own apartment, inflicting 63 wounds in a frenzy of violence, then cut himself during the attack and left his blood behind on a towel. Chirila was arrested in September 2021 and extradited to Honolulu to face charges of second-degree murder. The news shocked those who had known him in Nevada. How could a deputy attorney general, a man who had represented the state in court, be a murderer? But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. Nancy's siblings, now in their 60s and 70s, received the phone call they had waited 50 years to get. Their sister's killer had been identified. There would be a trial. There would finally be answers. It was beyond anything we could possibly even dream of after all these years, said Nancy's older sister, Carol Sampson. This was him. This is who killed our sister. But the path to justice took an unexpected and frustrating turn. As Chirila awaited trial in a Honolulu jail, he began refusing food, water, and medication. His health deteriorated rapidly. On December 25, 2023, Christmas Day, 51 years after Nancy had come home for that fateful Christmas visit, Tudor Chirila died in a hospital, never having stood trial for Nancy's murder. The case was officially closed in April 2024, when the murder charge was dismissed due to Chirila's death. But County of Honolulu Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Scott Bell, who had been preparing to prosecute the case, told reporters that he was confident he would have secured a conviction had Chirila lived to stand trial. Even though he wasn't found guilty in a court of law, he was found guilty in our hearts, said Nancy's sister Janet Christensen. Nancy Anderson's family held a memorial service after the case was resolved, gathering in Colorado to honor their sister's memory and acknowledge that after half a century, they finally knew the truth. They shared stories about Nancy's adventurous spirit, her magnetic personality, her dreams of living life to the fullest. They mourned not just the 19-year-old who had been murdered in 1972, but all the years of life that had been stolen from her. The career she never had, the children she never bore, the gray hair and laugh lines she never earned. Nancy was buried in a Colorado cemetery in 1972, her gravestone marking the brief span of her life. In 2024, her siblings placed flowers on that grave and finally, truly said goodbye, knowing that the person who had stolen Nancy's life had been identified, exposed, and would be remembered not for his career accomplishments, but for his brutal crime. Nancy Anderson's case became Hawaii's oldest cold case to be solved. It demonstrated once again the power of forensic genetic genealogy to reach back across decades and deliver justice even when traditional investigation methods had long since failed. And it reminded families still waiting for answers that science and determination can solve even the oldest mysteries. Case 3. Mary Schleiss, the hitchhiker who trusted the wrong driver, Wisconsin, 1974. Mary Kathleen Schleiss was 25 years old in February 1974, and art was her entire world. She had graduated from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, where her professors had recognized her exceptional talent and creative vision. Mary worked primarily in stained glass, creating intricate pieces that caught the light and transformed it into something magical. Her work had been featured in several local galleries, and she was beginning to make a name for herself in the Twin Cities art community. Mary lived in Minneapolis in a small apartment that doubled as her studio, where she spent long hours hunched over her workbench, cutting glass and soldering pieces together into beautiful designs. Friends described her as passionate about her craft, someone who could talk for hours about color theory and light refraction, someone who saw the world differently than most people, always looking for the beauty in ordinary things. In early February 1974, Mary received exciting news. An art show in Chicago was accepting submissions, and they were interested in featuring her work. It was exactly the kind of exposure she needed to take her career to the next level. The show was scheduled for mid-February, and Mary immediately began preparing, selecting her best pieces, carefully wrapping them for transport, making plans for the trip. There was just one problem. Mary didn't own a car. In 1974, hitchhiking was still a common and generally accepted way to travel, especially among young people and artists who often lacked the money for bus or train tickets. Mary had hitchhiked many times before without incident. Standing on highway on-ramps with her thumb out, accepting rides from strangers who were heading in the right direction. It seemed like the most practical way to get to Chicago with her art pieces. On February 14, 1974, Valentine's Day, Mary said goodbye to her roommate and set out on her journey. She wore practical clothes for traveling: jeans, a warm coat, sturdy boots to protect against the Minnesota winter cold. She carried her carefully wrapped stained glass pieces and a small overnight bag. Her plan was to hitchhike the roughly 400 miles from Minneapolis to Chicago, which she figured would take a day or so depending on how many rides she caught. Mary's roommate watched her walk down the street toward the highway, confident and excited about the opportunity ahead. She had no reason to worry. Mary was smart, street-savvy, careful about which rides she accepted. She'd be fine. But Mary Schlase never made it to Chicago. She never made it more than 75 miles from home. On the morning of February 15, 1974, just one day after Mary had left Minneapolis, a local man named Denny Anderson was driving along County Road T in the township of Springbrook, Dunn County, Wisconsin. It was a rural area, mostly farmland and woods, the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. As Anderson rounded a curve near the intersection of 408th Avenue and 990th Street, something caught his eye. There appeared to be someone lying in the snow at the side of the road. Anderson slowed down, squinting to see better in the gray winter light. As he got closer, his stomach dropped. It wasn't someone resting or a pile of discarded clothing. It was a body, a woman's body, partially covered by fresh snowfall, lying motionless in the ditch. Anderson immediately turned his car around and drove to the nearest house with a telephone, his hands shaking as he dialed the sheriff's office. Dunn County Sheriff's deputies responded within minutes, followed by investigators and the medical examiner. What they found at the scene was a brutal murder. The victim, later identified as Mary Schlase through personal items found near her body, had been stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner would later count the wounds: multiple stab wounds to her back, defensive wounds on her hands where she had tried to protect herself, evidence of a violent struggle. She had been killed and then dumped at the side of this rural road, left in the snow like garbage. Near Mary's body, investigators found a crucial piece of evidence: a knit stocking cap, the kind that pulls down over your ears to protect against winter cold. The hat wasn't Mary's. It was men's style, and it appeared to have been lost or discarded by the killer during the attack or while moving her body. Investigators carefully collected the hat and preserved it as evidence, noting that there were several hairs caught in the knit fabric. They also found tire tracks in the snow near where Mary's body lay, suggesting the killer had pulled off the road, attacked Mary, and then dumped her body before driving away. A witness, the same Denny Anderson who had discovered the body, reported that just minutes before finding Mary, he had passed a car pulled over at that exact spot. He had glimpsed the driver, a man whose face he would later say haunted him for years. The man had been staring at Anderson with an expression of panic or fear, the look of someone who had just been caught doing something terrible. Anderson provided a description of the man and the vehicle to investigators. But in 1974, without security cameras or digital databases, there was only so much they could do with that information. They interviewed people in the area, showed sketches of the suspect, followed up on tips from people who thought they recognized the description. But every lead went nowhere. Mary's family in Minneapolis was devastated. They had sent their daughter off to pursue her dreams, and she had been murdered less than a day later by some monster who had picked her up while she was hitchhiking. Mary's parents couldn't understand how something so terrible could happen to their kind, talented daughter. They buried her in Minneapolis, her gravestone marking the brief span of her life. Mary K. Schlase, 1948-1974. The investigation continued for months, then years, but no suspect was ever identified. The case went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved murders in files across the country. The stocking cap with the hairs sat in an evidence room, waiting for science to advance enough to make use of it. Decades passed. Mary's parents grew old and died, never knowing who had killed their daughter. But Mary's case was never truly forgotten. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office kept the files, and periodically, new investigators would pull them out, review them, hope to find something that previous generations had missed. In the early 2000s, as DNA technology advanced, the hairs from the stocking cap were finally tested. A DNA profile was extracted and entered into CODES, the National DNA Database. But there were no matches. The killer had either never been arrested for another crime, or had committed this murder before DNA collection became standard practice. The case stalled again. But by then, investigators knew they had something valuable: a complete DNA profile of Mary's killer. They just needed to figure out how to identify whose DNA it was. Then, in 2023, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would finally crack the case. They would partner with Ramapo College in New Jersey, which had established one of the first university-based investigative genetic genealogy centers in the country. The center specialized in using DNA and genealogy to solve cold cases, training students in forensic genealogy while helping law enforcement agencies identify unknown suspects. The DNA profile from the stocking cap was uploaded to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, looking for distant relatives of the killer who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to explore their ancestry. The profile didn't match anyone directly, but it showed connections to several distant relatives. Third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared segments of DNA with the killer. Ramapo College students, working under the supervision of professional genetic genealogists, began the painstaking work of building family trees from these distant matches. They traced ancestry back several generations, then forward through multiple family lines, cross-referencing with historical records, census data, birth and death certificates, marriage records, newspaper archives. The work took months. Students would spend hours poring over records, eliminating possibilities, following new leads, hitting dead ends, and starting over. But slowly, they began to narrow down the possibilities. The killer's ancestry pointed to specific regions and specific family lines. They could identify families that had lived in Wisconsin and Minnesota in 1974. They could start building lists of men who would have been the right age to commit this crime. One name kept appearing in their research: John K. Miller of Owatonna, Minnesota. Miller was 84 years old in 2024, living quietly in southern Minnesota. He had been adopted as a child, which had initially made him harder to track through genealogical research. His adopted family name didn't match his biological ancestry. But eventually, the genealogists identified him as a strong candidate. Miller had been 34 years old in February 1974. He had lived in Minnesota, not far from where Mary had begun her hitchhiking journey. His biological family connections matched the DNA profile from the stocking cap. Everything pointed to him, but before approaching Miller directly, investigators needed to confirm the connection. They obtained a court order to collect DNA from Miller's adult daughter, who was willing to cooperate with the investigation. When her DNA was analyzed and compared to the profile from the stocking cap, the results were definitive. The DNA from the stocking cap belonged to her biological father. John Miller was Mary Schlase's killer. On November 7, 2024, 50 years, 8 months, and 23 days after Mary's murder, Dunn County Sheriff's investigators arrested John Miller at his home in Owatonna. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Mary Schlase. During the initial interview, Miller denied knowing anything about Mary's murder. He claimed he had never been in that area of Wisconsin, had never picked up a hitchhiker on that February day in 1974. But when investigators presented him with the DNA evidence, explaining that his DNA had been found on a stocking cap at the crime scene, that genetic genealogy had identified him with virtual certainty, Miller's story changed. According to the criminal complaint filed in Dunn County Circuit Court, Miller admitted to picking up Mary Schlase while she was hitchhiking along the highway. He said he had asked her for sexual contact, and when she refused, he grabbed a knife he had concealed in his car and stabbed her in the back. He described pulling off the road in the remote area where her body was later found, trying to hide her in a snowbank, but getting scared when another car drove by. That car driven by Denny Anderson, the man who would return minutes later to find Mary's body. Miller admitted the stocking cap found at the scene was his. He had apparently lost it during the attack or while moving Mary's body, never realizing that this one piece of physical evidence would ultimately lead to his identification 50 years later. The news of Miller's arrest made national headlines. After half a century, one of Wisconsin's most puzzling cold cases had finally been solved. Dunn County Sheriff Kevin Bigd held a press conference to announce the breakthrough, praising the work of the investigators and the Ramapo College genetic genealogy team. "This is a huge accomplishment for our agency," Sheriff Bigd said. "This is the first case we've ever solved using investigative genetic genealogy, but it won't be the last. This technology has proven that even after 50 years, we can still find the truth and deliver justice." For Mary's surviving family members, siblings, nieces, nephews who had grown up knowing their aunt had been murdered, but never knowing by whom, the arrest brought overwhelming emotions. Relief that the case was finally solved. Anger that Miller had lived a normal life for 50 years while Mary lay in her grave. Sadness that Mary's parents had died without knowing the truth. "We never thought this day would come," said one of Mary's relatives in a statement. 50 years is a long time to wait for justice. We're grateful to everyone who never gave up on Mary's case. John Miller was extradited to Wisconsin to face trial. On March 27, 2025, at the age of 84, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Mary Schlase. He will almost certainly die in prison, finally being held accountable for the crime he committed half a century earlier. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor read a victim impact statement on behalf of Mary's family. Mary Schlase was a talented artist with a bright future. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She was heading to Chicago to showcase her art, to pursue her dreams. And John Miller took all of that away from her. He took her life, and then he ran. He lived his life while Mary's ended in a frozen ditch at the side of a road. Today, 50 years later, justice is finally served. Mary Schleus's case demonstrated once again the power of forensic genetic genealogy to solve even the oldest cold cases. It also showed the value of properly preserving evidence. That stocking cap collected in 1974 had been carefully stored for 5 decades, waiting for science to advance enough to make use of it. And it proved that law enforcement agencies, when willing to embrace new technologies and partner with academic institutions, can achieve breakthroughs that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Mary is buried in Minneapolis, her gravestone now bearing not just her dates of birth and death, but also a small plaque added by her family. Justice served, March 27, 2025. After 50 years, Mary Schleus can finally rest in peace, her killer identified, convicted, and imprisoned. Case 4. Susan Negersmith. The shore vacation that ended in horror. New Jersey, 1990. Memorial Day weekend 1990 was supposed to be a celebration of freedom and summer fun for 20-year-old Susan Negersmith and her friends. Susan, a college student from Carmel, New York, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A long weekend at the Jersey Shore, the classic rite of passage for young people from the New York metro area. Sun, sand, boardwalk games, late-night parties, the kind of memories that last a lifetime. Susan was the kind of young woman everyone gravitated toward. Her family described her as vibrant, outgoing, always ready with a smile and a laugh. She was the middle child in her family, with an older sister named Dawn and a much younger sister named Emily, who was just 2 years old that summer. Susan doted on little Emily, always bringing her small presents, playing with her for hours, already showing signs of the nurturing personality that would have made her an excellent mother someday. At 20, Susan was at that exciting stage of life where everything seemed possible. She was doing well in college, making plans for her future career, falling in and out of love with the intensity that only 20-year-olds can manage. Her parents, Frank and his wife, were proud of the young woman their daughter was becoming. Responsible, kind-hearted, full of potential. The Memorial Day trip to Wildwood, New Jersey was meant to be a girls' weekend. Susan and 3 friends rented a cheap motel room near the boardwalk, pooled their money for gas and food, packed their most fashionable beach clothes. They drove down to the shore on Friday, May 25th, 1990. Windows down, music blasting, singing along to the radio, anticipating 3 days of complete freedom from school stress and parental supervision. The weekend started wonderfully. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm without being oppressively hot. The girls spent Saturday on the beach, soaking up the sun, people watching, occasionally dipping into the Atlantic Ocean's still cold spring waters. That evening, they hit the boardwalk, riding the rides, playing skee-ball, eating funnel cakes and saltwater taffy, laughing until their stomachs hurt. Saturday night, they changed into their clubbing clothes and headed out to experience Wildwood's famous nightlife. The town was packed with young people from all over the tri-state area, all looking to party and have fun. The girls bar hopped, danced, met new people, collected phone numbers from boys who would never call. It was the kind of night that Susan and her friends would normally have talked about for months afterward. But Sunday, May 27, 1990, everything went wrong. The details of what happened that day remain somewhat murky, even after all these years. At some point on Sunday, Susan became separated from her friends. Different accounts suggest she may have met someone, may have gone off on her own for reasons that were never fully explained. Her friends assumed she would meet them back at the motel room. But when she didn't show up by late afternoon, they began to worry. They checked the beach, the boardwalk, called her name, asked other vacationers if they'd seen her. As evening fell and Susan still hadn't appeared, her friends' worry turned to panic. They went to the Wildwood Police Department to report her missing, explaining that Susan wasn't the type to just disappear, that something must be wrong. The police took a report but weren't overly concerned. Young people on vacation sometimes wandered off, met someone new, lost track of time. Susan would probably turn up with a sheepish explanation and a hangover. But they agreed to keep an eye out for her. Early Monday morning, May 28, 1990. A restaurant worker arriving for the morning shift at a Wildwood eatery made a horrifying discovery. Behind the restaurant's dumpster, partially hidden from view, was the body of a young woman. She was partially clothed, clearly the victim of violence, left like garbage in an alley behind a family restaurant. Police responded immediately, cordoning off the area and beginning a crime scene investigation. The victim was identified as Susan Nigger-Smith through her personal belongings. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. The brutality of the attack was shocking. Susan had been murdered with extreme violence, her body showing signs of a sustained assault that spoke of rage and hatred. The medical examiner's initial report, however, contained a conclusion that would haunt Susan's family for years. Manner of death was listed as accidental. How a young woman found beaten, sexually assaulted, and dead behind a dumpster could be considered an accidental death was incomprehensible to Susan's family. But in 1990, authorities seemed more interested in protecting Wildwood's reputation as a family-friendly vacation destination than in pursuing justice for a murdered young woman. Susan's father, Frank Nigger-Smith, was devastated and enraged. His beloved daughter had been murdered, and the authorities were trying to sweep it under the rug by calling it an accident. He refused to accept that conclusion. For the next 3 years, Frank became his daughter's advocate, calling the Cape May County Prosecutor's Office repeatedly, demanding they re-examine the case, insisting that Susan had been murdered. Frank's relentless advocacy finally paid off. In 1993, a different medical examiner reviewed Susan's case and reversed the original finding. Susan's death was officially ruled a homicide. It had taken 3 years, but at least now the investigation could proceed with the seriousness it deserved. Despite the reclassification, the investigation made little progress. Detectives interviewed dozens of people who had been in Wildwood that Memorial Day weekend, tracked down potential witnesses, followed up on tips. But they had no suspect, no clear motive, no obvious leads. There was, however, physical evidence. DNA samples had been collected from Susan's body during the autopsy, DNA that belonged to her attacker. In 1990, DNA technology was still relatively new, and the databases used to compare DNA samples were small. Susan's case DNA was preserved and stored, waiting for technology and databases to advance enough to be useful. Frank Nigger-Smith never stopped fighting for justice for his daughter. For years, he called the prosecutor's office, wrote letters, did everything he could to keep Susan's case in the public eye. This was a daily topic of conversation for my dad, Susan's younger sister Emily would later say. He was completely relentless in his pursuit of justice for Susan. Tragically, Frank Nigger-Smith died in the early 2010s without seeing his daughter's killer brought to justice. But before his death, he extracted promises from his surviving daughters, Dawn and Emily, that they would continue the fight. They would never stop seeking justice for Susan. The years passed slowly. Dawn and Emily Nigger-Smith kept their promise to their father, periodically contacting the Cape May County Prosecutor's Office, asking about the case, refusing to let Susan be forgotten. And behind the scenes, advances in DNA technology were creating new possibilities. In 2020, Mainkicht. In 2018, investigators with the Cape May County Prosecutor's Office Major Crimes Cold Case Unit decided to take another look at Susan's case using new DNA analysis techniques and genetic genealogy. The DNA profile from Susan's attacker was uploaded to genealogy databases, looking for family connections that might lead to his identity. The process took months, but eventually, genetic genealogists identified a potential suspect, Jerry Rosado, a 62-year-old man from Millville, New Jersey. Rosado had lived in southern New Jersey in 1990 and could have easily been in Wildwood over Memorial Day weekend. Investigators obtained a court order to collect a DNA sample from Rosado for comparison. The results came back in 2022. It was a match. Jerry Rosado's DNA matched the DNA from Susan Negersmith's sexual assault with virtual certainty. After 32 years, Susan's attacker had been identified. On April 7, 2022, Jerry Rosado was arrested and charged with second-degree sexual assault in connection with Susan Negersmith's death. Notably, he was not immediately charged with murder. Prosecutors needed time to build their homicide case. But the sexual assault charge was strong enough to ensure Rosado could be held while that work continued. The news of the arrest reached Emily and Dawn Negersmith, who were now women in their 30s and 50s respectively, having spent most of their lives waiting for this moment. Emily, who had been just 2 years old when Susan died and had no personal memories of her sister, had grown up hearing stories about Susan, looking at photographs, feeling the hole in her family where Susan should have been. The idea that there's been some closure isn't totally accurate yet. Emily told reporters after Rosado's arrest, "We still have a battle ahead of us. We want this guy put away for as long as possible." At his detention hearing on April 13, 2022, Rosado appeared before a judge for the first time. His defense attorney requested case files and discovery, noting that authorities had been investigating this case for 32 years and requesting time to review the evidence. The prosecutor's office fought against Rosado being released on bail, arguing that he posed a flight risk and a danger to the community. The case highlighted both the power and the limitations of DNA evidence in cold cases. While the DNA conclusively proved that Rosado had sexually assaulted Susan Negersmith, building a murder case after 32 years presented challenges. Witnesses had died or disappeared. Memories had faded. Physical evidence beyond the DNA was limited. But prosecutors in Cape May County were determined to see the case through. As of 2024, the investigation into charging Rosado with Susan's murder remained ongoing, with additional charges expected as the case built toward trial. For Susan's sisters, the arrest of Jerry Rosado finally validated their father's decades-long insistence that Susan had been murdered and that justice must be served. "My dad never stopped fighting," Dawn said. "He never gave up on Susan. And now, even though he's not here to see it, the person who did this has finally been caught." Susan Negersmith is buried in New York, her gravestone bearing her dates of birth and death and the inscription, "Forever loved, never forgotten." Her family visits regularly, bringing flowers, sitting by her grave, telling her about the progress in her case, promising that they will never stop fighting for justice on her behalf. The resolution of Susan's case, even without a murder conviction yet secured, demonstrates that families who refuse to give up, who keep fighting and advocating and demanding justice, can eventually see results. Frank Negersmith spent the rest of his life fighting for his daughter. And though he didn't live to see the arrest, his determination and refusal to accept injustice ultimately led to the breakthrough that identified Susan's killer. Case 5. Leila Johnston, 50 years of waiting, Oklahoma, 1976. The morning of May 14th, 1976, started like any other spring day in the quiet residential neighborhood on the northwest side of Oklahoma City. Neighbors were getting ready for work. Children were preparing for school. The sounds of a typical Friday morning filled the air. But in the modest home where 68-year-old Layla Mae Johnston lived alone, something terrible had happened overnight. Layla was a pillar of her community, known to everyone on her block as the sweet grandmother who always had cookies for neighborhood children and a kind word for anyone who stopped by. She had lived in that house for decades, raising her children there, welcoming grandchildren, building a life filled with family, faith, and community involvement. After her husband's death some years earlier, Layla had continued living independently, determined to maintain her home and her dignity despite the loneliness that sometimes comes with widowhood. Her family was protective of her, checking in regularly, making sure she had everything she needed. Her daughter called her every morning and evening. Her son stopped by several times a week. Her grandchildren visited on weekends, bringing little gifts and big hugs. Layla's family knew that as she aged, she became more vulnerable, and they did their best to watch over her while still respecting her independence. But on the morning of May 14th, when Layla's neighbor came over for their usual morning coffee, she found the front door slightly ajar. Unusual, because Layla was meticulous about keeping her house locked. The neighbor called out Layla's name as she pushed the door open, but only silence answered. A sense of dread settled over her as she stepped into the living room. Layla lay on the floor, clearly beyond help. She had been beaten to death in her own home, the violence of the attack evident in the injuries visible on her body. The neighbor screamed and ran to call police, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial the rotary phone. Oklahoma City Police Department officers responded within minutes, followed quickly by detectives and crime scene investigators. What they found was a brutal scene. An elderly woman who had been attacked with such violence that it suggested rage, personal hatred, or complete loss of control. The medical examiner would later determine that Layla had been beaten to death, suffering massive trauma that no 68-year-old woman could have survived. The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting Layla may have known her attacker and let them in, or that the killer had found an unlocked door and taken advantage of it. Some items appeared to have been disturbed, but it wasn't clear if robbery had been the motive. Nothing obviously valuable seemed to be missing, but Layla's purse had been rifled through, drawers had been opened, suggesting the killer had been looking for something. Investigators interviewed everyone in the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual the night before or early that morning. They talked to Layla's family members, trying to determine if she had mentioned being afraid of anyone, if she had any enemies, if there were any conflicts in her life that might have led to such violence. They found nothing. Layla had been universally loved. Nobody could imagine who would want to hurt her, much less murder her with such brutality. Physical evidence was collected from the crime scene: fingerprints, fibers, samples that might contain the killer's DNA. Though DNA technology in 1976 was still years away from practical use in criminal investigations, the evidence was properly preserved and stored, following protocols of the time, waiting for science to advance enough to make it useful. The investigation continued for weeks, then months. Every lead was pursued, every tip followed up. But as is so often the case with cold cases, the trail eventually went cold. Without witnesses, without a clear motive, without modern forensic technology, investigators had nowhere left to turn. Layla Johnston's murder joined the growing stack of unsolved cases in the Oklahoma City PD files. For Layla's family, especially her granddaughter Leslie Sullinger, the lack of closure was agonizing. Leslie had been a young woman when her grandmother was murdered. And as the years passed, as she grew older, married, had children and grandchildren of her own, the pain of not knowing who had killed Grandma Layla never faded. "I thought it would never be finished," Leslie would later say. "It had been so long. I had honestly given up hope that we would ever know what happened or who did it." Decades passed. The 1970s became the 80s, then the 90s, then the new millennium. Investigators who had worked on Layla's case retired or died. The neighborhood where she had lived changed, old houses torn down and replaced, new families moving in who had never heard of Layla Johnston. But in the cold case files of the Oklahoma City Police Department, Layla's case remained open, waiting for someone to give it fresh attention. That moment came in 2023, when the OCPD Cold Case Unit decided to try something the department had never done before: use investigative genetic genealogy to solve a homicide case. It would be a first for the agency, a proof of concept that could open the door to solving dozens or even hundreds of old cold cases if it worked. Layla Johnston's case was selected as the test case. The physical evidence collected in 1976 had been well preserved, stored properly in conditions that prevented degradation. Investigators sent the evidence to DNA Labs International, a specialized forensic laboratory that deals with cold cases and degraded DNA samples. The lab worked for months, using cutting-edge techniques to extract DNA from evidence that was nearly 50 years old. Eventually, they succeeded in creating a genetic profile from DNA that appeared to belong to the killer. That profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases, beginning the process of building a family tree that might lead to the killer's identity. Genetic genealogists worked backward from distant DNA matches, tracing family lines through multiple generations, cross-referencing with historical records, birth and death certificates, census data, newspaper archives. The work was painstakingly slow, often hitting dead ends that required starting over from different angles. But slowly, a name emerged: Charles Droke. Investigators discovered that Droke had a violent criminal history and had been living in Oklahoma City in 1976, not far from where Layla Johnston lived. His background fit the profile of someone capable of this kind of violence. And most importantly, when his known DNA profile was compared to the DNA from Layla's case, it was a match. There was just one problem. Charles Droke had himself been murdered years earlier. He would never stand trial for Layla's murder, but at least the mystery was solved. At least Layla's family would finally know who had killed her and why. In 2024, the Oklahoma City Police Department held a press conference to announce that they had solved the murder of Layla Johnston using investigative genetic genealogy. It was the first homicide case the department had ever solved using this technique, and it demonstrated the potential for solving many more cold cases. When Leslie Sullinger received the phone call telling her that her grandmother's killer had been identified, she broke down in tears. "I never thought this day would come," she said. "After almost 50 years, I had given up hope. But they did it. They found out who killed Grandma Layla." The resolution brought Leslie and her family a sense of peace they hadn't felt in decades. They could finally stop wondering, stop imagining worst-case scenarios, stop carrying the weight of unanswered questions. They knew the truth, even if the killer himself would never face trial. Layla Johnston is buried in Oklahoma City, her gravestone marking the date of her death in 1976. After the case was solved, her family held a small memorial service at her grave, thanking the detectives and genealogists who had never given up, celebrating the life of a woman who deserved so much better than to die violently in her own home. "Grandma Layla can finally rest in peace," Leslie said at the graveside service. She knows now that we never forgot her, that we never stopped looking for answers. And she knows that the person who did this has been exposed. That's justice, even if it came 50 years late. Case 6. Karen Klaas, The Righteous Brothers Tragedy, California, 1976. The morning of January 30th, 1976, started normally for 32-year-old Karen Klaas. She woke up in her modest but comfortable home in Hermosa Beach, California, got her 4-year-old son Darren ready for preschool, and prepared to drop him off before meeting friends for their regular Friday morning coffee. It was a routine she'd followed countless times before. One of those ordinary moments that make up the texture of everyday life. Moments that you take for granted until suddenly you can't anymore. Karen was known throughout the South Bay Beach communities as a warm, vibrant woman who had successfully navigated one of life's most challenging transitions, divorce. She had been married to Bill Medley, one half of the famous singing duo The Righteous Brothers, whose deep baritone voice had helped create timeless hits like Unchained Melody and You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin'. The marriage had produced 2 sons, Darren and Damien, before ending in divorce in 1970. But unlike many celebrity divorces, Karen and Bill had maintained an amicable relationship, co-parenting their boys with mutual respect and even genuine friendship. "My ex-wife was one of my best friends after the divorce," Bill Medley would later say. "She was a wonderful, wonderful girl." Karen had built a good life for herself in Hermosa Beach, a close-knit coastal community where neighbors actually knew each other and looked out for one another. She lived in a neat little house, worked part-time, and devoted most of her energy to raising Darren and Damien. Her friends adored her, describing her as someone who listened without judgment, laughed easily, and always made time for people she cared about. That Friday morning, Karen dropped Darren off at the McMartin preschool in nearby Manhattan Beach. She chatted briefly with other parents, mentioned she was meeting friends for coffee, and waved goodbye to her son. It would be the last time anyone who loved her saw her alive. Karen drove back to her home on Pier Avenue in Hermosa Beach, intending to freshen up before meeting her friends. She pulled into her driveway, gathered her purse, and walked to her front door, completely unaware that someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. What happened next would remain unknown for 41 years, pieced together only from forensic evidence and crime scene analysis. Someone followed Karen into her home, either forcing their way in behind her or possibly having been hiding inside, though there were no signs of forced entry to suggest the latter. Once inside, the intruder attacked Karen with brutal violence. She fought back. The house showed signs of a struggle, furniture disturbed, items knocked over, evidence that Karen had tried desperately to defend herself. But her attacker was stronger, more vicious, determined. He sexually assaulted her, then strangled her with her own pantyhose, applying pressure until she lost consciousness. When Karen didn't show up for coffee at the appointed time, her friends became concerned. Karen was punctual, reliable, the type of person who called if she was running even 5 minutes late. After trying her phone several times with no answer, one of the friends decided to drive by Karen's house to check on her. What the friend found would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she approached the house, she saw a man leaving, a white male with bushy, curly brown hair, moving quickly, looking furtive and nervous. Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells. The friend watched as the man got into a vehicle and drove away, then hurried to Karen's front door. The door was slightly ajar. The friend called Karen's name as she pushed it open, but only silence answered. She stepped inside and found Karen lying on the floor, unconscious barely breathing, her face bruised and swollen from the strangulation. The friend screamed and ran to call police. Hermosa Beach Police Department officers and paramedics arrived within minutes. Karen was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, her brain deprived of oxygen for so long that doctors weren't sure she would survive. She lingered in a coma for 5 agonizing days, while Bill Medley and their sons kept vigil at her bedside, praying for a miracle that never came. On February 4th, 1976, Karen Klaas died from her injuries without ever regaining consciousness. The investigation began immediately, with Hermosa Beach detectives working around the clock to identify Karen's killer. They had a witness description of the man seen leaving the house. Bushy, curly brown hair, white male, medium build. They had physical evidence from the crime scene, including biological samples collected during the autopsy that contained the killer's DNA, though DNA analysis wouldn't be possible for decades to come. Detectives interviewed everyone in Karen's life, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to hurt her. They investigated 5 possible suspects based on the witness description and connections to Karen. Each was eventually ruled out through investigation or, years later, through DNA testing. For Bill Medley and his sons, the grief was compounded by frustration. "You've lost that lovin' feelin'" played on radios around the world, a bittersweet reminder of better times, while the man who had murdered Karen walked free. Darren and Damian Medley grew up without their mother, robbed of the chance to have her at their graduations, their weddings, the births of their own children. Bill had to explain to his young sons why Mommy wasn't coming home. Had to watch them struggle with trauma and loss that no child should have to endure. The case went cold. Detectives retired or moved on to other assignments. Evidence sat in storage, properly preserved according to 1976 protocols, waiting for technology to advance enough to make it useful. Bill Medley occasionally gave interviews about the case, always holding out hope that someday, somehow, investigators would find Karen's killer. "I always hoped," he would say. "You never give up hope." But as the years went by, I started to think we might never know. Then came advances in DNA technology that changed everything. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement agencies across California began revisiting old cold cases, testing evidence that had been collected decades earlier, entering DNA profiles into CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, and state databases. In 1999, Hermosa Beach Police Department reopened Karen's case and had the biological evidence tested. A DNA profile was extracted from samples collected during the 1976 autopsy. A complete profile of Karen's killer. When that profile was entered into databases, however, there were no direct matches. The killer had either never been arrested for another crime, or had committed this murder before DNA collection became standard practice. The case stalled again, but investigators now had something valuable: a genetic fingerprint of the killer. They just needed to figure out how to identify whose DNA it was. In 2011, California implemented a groundbreaking familial DNA search program, one of the first in the nation. This technique allowed investigators to search DNA databases not just for direct matches, but for partial matches that might indicate a close family member, a father, son, or brother of the person who committed the crime. Hermosa Beach detectives submitted Karen's case for a familial DNA search, but the 2011 search came back with no viable matches. Either the killer's close relatives hadn't been arrested and entered into the database, or the technology hadn't yet advanced enough to find the connections. But by 2016, the databases were larger, the technology more refined. Detectives tried again, and this time they got a hit. a partial DNA match to someone in California's offender database. The match wasn't to the killer himself, but to someone who shared enough DNA with the killer to be a very close relative. A first-degree relative like a father or son. Investigators began the careful process of building a family tree from this match, identifying all potential relatives who could have been in the Los Angeles area in 1976. One name emerged as the most likely suspect: Kenneth Eugene Troyer, born in 1946. When detectives looked into Troyer's background, they found a history of violence that made him a perfect fit for Karen's murder. Troyer had been imprisoned at California Men's Colony State Prison in San Luis Obispo for sexual assault. In February 1982, 6 years after Karen's murder, he had escaped from prison. During his brief time on the run, he was suspected of committing several robberies, assaults, and sexual assaults in Orange County. Troyer's crime spree ended on March 3, 1982, when police in Orange County located him. When officers attempted to apprehend him, Troyer resisted violently. In the ensuing confrontation, police shot and killed him. At the time, investigators had no idea that Troyer was also responsible for Karen Klaas's murder 4 years earlier. But there was one crucial piece of evidence that could prove the connection. When Troyer died in 1982, the coroner's office had collected blood samples and tissue as part of the standard autopsy procedure. Those samples had been preserved in the coroner's files for 35 years, waiting to be useful. In late 2016, Hermosa Beach detectives obtained a court order to collect DNA from the coroner's preserved samples of Troyer's remains. The samples were sent to a forensic laboratory for analysis and comparison with the DNA from Karen's 1976 crime scene. The results came back definitive. Kenneth Eugene Troyer's DNA matched the DNA from Karen Klaas's sexual assault with virtual certainty. After 40 years, Karen's killer had been identified. On January 30th, 2017, exactly 41 years to the day after Karen's attack, Los Angeles County Sheriff Jim McDonnell held a press conference at the Hall of Justice in downtown Los Angeles. Flanked by Hermosa Beach Police Department officials and other law enforcement personnel, McDonnell announced that Karen Klaas's murder had been solved. Through the perseverance of detectives and the familial DNA process, we were able to finally provide some degree of closure to Karen's family, McDonnell said. Bill Medley attended the press conference with his now adult sons, Darren and Damien, standing behind him when he stepped up to the microphone. His voice, that famous deep baritone that had filled concert halls and topped the charts, shook with emotion. "It's closure," Medley said. "When I was told, I just kind of became numb because this is something you've been hoping for, speculating about for 40 years. And all of a sudden they say, 'We got him,' and here's who did it." He paused, composing himself before continuing. "We miss Karen. The most important thing is the boys didn't get to grow up with their mother. She would have been an incredible grandma, and she was a wonderful, wonderful girl." Darren and Damien Medley, now middle-aged men who had spent most of their lives without their mother, stood silently as their father spoke, tears streaming down their faces. They had been 4 and 6 years old when their mother was murdered. Too young to have many memories of her, but old enough to feel the hole her absence left in their lives. The resolution of Karen's case brought national attention to California's familial DNA search program, which by 2017 had helped solve several high-profile cold cases. District Attorney Jackie Lacey praised the technology at the press conference. "It was just 7 years ago that we conducted California's first familial DNA search, which resulted in removing Lonnie Franklin Jr., the serial killer known as the Grim Sleeper, from our community. But for Bill Medley and his family, The headlines and the technology were secondary to the simple fact that they finally knew the truth. Kenneth Troyer had murdered Karen. He had gotten away with it for 6 years before police killed him in 1982. He had died without ever being held accountable for what he'd done to Karen and her family. "I'm happy for the family that we get to close the book," Medley said at the press conference. Then he paused and added, "I'd come to terms with the possibility that the case would never be solved. But I never stopped hoping." Karen Kloss is buried in California. Her gravestone bearing the dates 1943 to 1976 and an inscription chosen by her sons, "Beloved mother and friend." After the case was solved, Darren and Damian Medley visited their mother's grave to tell her the news, standing in silence for a long time before speaking. "We finally know, Mom," Darren said softly. "We finally know who did this. You can rest now." Bill Medley continues to perform, his voice still powerful in his 80s. But every time he sings Unchained Melody or You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin', he thinks of Karen, of the young woman he once loved, of the mother his sons barely got to know. He keeps a photo of her in his dressing room, a reminder of the life that was stolen and the justice that took 41 years to arrive. Case 7. Sherry Jarvis. Walker County Jane Doe comes home. Texas, 1980. For 41 years, she was known only as Walker County Jane Doe, a nameless teenager whose battered body was found on the side of Interstate 45 in Huntsville, Texas, on November 1st, 1980. She had no identification. No one reported her missing. No family came forward to claim her. She was buried in a donated plot at Oakwood Cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that read, "Jane Doe, November 1st, 1980. But Jane Doe was someone's daughter. She was someone's sister, someone's friend, someone who had once had a name and a family and dreams for the future. And for more than 4 decades, people refused to let her remain nameless. The story of Walker County Jane Doe captured the imagination of countless people over the years. Amateur sleuths, forensic artists, DNA analysts, and ordinary citizens who couldn't bear the thought of this young girl lying in an unmarked grave with no one to remember her real name. They visited her grave, left flowers, vowed not to give up until she was identified. One woman in particular, Marina Willis Bozeman Brinkley of Gatesville, Texas, became obsessed with solving the mystery. She created a website dedicated to identifying Jane Doe, compiling every scrap of information available about the case, reaching out to missing persons organizations, never giving up hope that someday, somehow, this girl would get her name back. "I prayed for so long for this day to come," Brinkley would later say when the breakthrough finally arrived. The events that led to Jane Doe's death began more than 1,300 miles away in Stillwater, Minnesota, in March 1980. That's when 14-year-old Sherry Ann Tottie Jarvis ran away from state custody where she'd been placed due to habitual truancy from school. Sherry's childhood had been difficult. She came from a large family and struggled academically, skipping school so often that child welfare authorities eventually removed her from her home and placed her under state supervision. At age 13, being taken from her family and placed in the system was traumatic and confusing. Sherry felt abandoned, angry, convinced that she didn't deserve to be separated from her siblings and parents. Shortly after her 14th birthday, in March 1980, Sherry made a decision that would ultimately cost her life. She ran away from her state placement, determined to make it on her own, rather than stay in a system she neither understood nor trusted. For months, Sherry traveled, hitchhiking across the country, surviving on the kindness of strangers and whatever odd jobs she could find. In August 1980, she sent a letter home to her mother from Denver, Colorado. It was the last contact her family would ever have with her. In the letter, Sherry expressed frustration at being placed in state custody, but said she intended to eventually return home. She just needed time to figure things out, she wrote. She needed to prove she could take care of herself. Then she would come back. Sherry's mother kept that letter for the rest of her life, reading it over and over, wondering what had happened to her daughter, hoping that someday Sherry would walk through the door with an explanation and an apology. That day never came. On October 31st, 1980, Halloween night, Sherry Jarvis was spotted at 2 locations in Huntsville, Texas, a small city about 70 miles north of Houston. Witnesses at a truck stop remembered talking to her. She was friendly, chatty, claiming she was from Texas, though her Minnesota accent suggested otherwise. She seemed to be looking for a ride somewhere, though she wasn't clear about where she was trying to go. That was the last time anyone saw Sherry Jarvis alive. The next morning, November 1st, 1980, a truck driver was heading south on Interstate 45 when he spotted what looked like a person lying in the grass on the shoulder of the highway, just south of the intersection with FM 1696. He slowed down, then pulled over, then got out to investigate. What he found was a nightmare. A young girl, appearing to be in her mid-teens, lay dead in the grass. She was naked except for a pair of orange socks. She had been severely beaten. Her face was bruised and swollen beyond recognition, her body showing signs of violent assault. The medical examiner would later determine she had been strangled to death. There was no identification on or near the body. No purse, no wallet, no clothing that might have had labels or tags. The orange socks were her only possession, and they told investigators nothing except that at some point, someone had cared enough about her to give her socks to wear. Walker County Sheriff's deputies processed the crime scene and began the grim work of trying to identify the victim. They took fingerprints, but found no matches in any database. They photographed her, but no one came forward to identify her from the photos. They checked missing persons reports from Texas and surrounding states, but found no matches. An autopsy revealed that the girl had been about 5.4 tall, weighing roughly 120 pounds, with light brown hair and hazel eyes. She appeared to be between 14 and 18 years old. But beyond these basic physical descriptors, they knew nothing about who she was or where she'd come from. The girl was buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Huntsville in a donated plot. Because she had no name, she was given one by default: Walker County Jane Doe. People in Huntsville began referring to her as the girl in the orange socks, a nickname that was both descriptive and heartbreaking. Over the years, Walker County investigators periodically returned to the case, hoping new leads or new technology might help identify the victim. In 1999, the body was exhumed for DNA testing. A DNA profile was extracted and entered into databases, but there were no matches. Forensic artist Carl Koppelman created multiple reconstructions of what Jane Doe might have looked like before the beating that killed her, trying to show the girl's face as it would have appeared in life. These reconstructions were shared widely online and in missing persons bulletins, generating hundreds of tips, but none that led to an identification. The case generated significant attention online, with true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators creating forums and social media groups dedicated to solving the mystery. Theories abounded. Maybe she was a trafficking victim. Maybe she'd run away from home. Maybe she'd been hitchhiking and got into the wrong vehicle. But without a name, All investigators could do was speculate. Then, in 2020, Walker County Sheriff's Office made the decision to partner with Othram Inc., a Texas-based company that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. It was a last-ditch effort, 40 years after the murder, to finally give Jane Doe her identity back. The initial attempts to extract usable DNA from the exhumed remains were unsuccessful. 40 years of burial had degraded the samples significantly. But when Othram technicians tested preserved tissue samples that had been collected during the 1999 exhumation, they were able to extract enough genetic material to create a profile. That profile was uploaded to genealogy databases, and the painstaking work of building a family tree began. Genetic genealogists traced family lines back generations, then forward through multiple descendants, looking for connections that might lead to Jane Doe's identity. In late September 2021, Carl Koppelman, the forensic artist who had created reconstructions of Jane Doe years earlier, announced on social media that she had been identified. He didn't reveal her name immediately, saying the family needed time to process the news privately before it became public. Finally, on November 9th, 2021, Walker County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce the identification. Walker County Jane Doe was Sherry Ann Jarvis of Stillwater, Minnesota. The girl who had been buried nameless for 41 years finally had her identity back. Sherry's family released a statement expressing their grief and gratitude. "We lost Sherry more than 41 years ago, and we've lived in bewilderment every day since, until now as she has finally been found. We want to thank all who have worked tirelessly to find Sherry and provide the long-awaited, albeit painful, answers to our many years of questions." The statement continued. "The compassion shown for a girl who was unnamed for so long, and who few people seemed to be looking for, was remarkable. Our Sherry was special. And this tragedy shows that someone robbed our family of so many memories together. Though we cannot move forward with her, we will forever cherish what time we were given." Marina Willis Bozeman Brinkley, who had maintained the website about Jane Doe for years, was overwhelmed with emotion. "We are all so glad she finally has her identity back," she said. "Honestly, I am still in shock. I prayed for so long for this day to come, and now it has." With Sherry's identification came new investigative leads. Detectives now knew she had been hitchhiking from Minnesota, had been in Denver in August, had ended up in Texas by Halloween. They could try to trace her route, identify people who might have seen her, look for anyone who had connections to both Minnesota and Texas in 1980. Most importantly, they had a fresh reason to push for DNA testing of potential suspects. When Jane Doe was nameless, the case had limited investigative traction. But now that she had a name and a family demanding justice, the investigation could move forward with renewed urgency. As of 2024, Sherry Jarvis's murder remains unsolved. Her killer has never been identified or arrested. But her grave no longer bears the name Jane Doe. It now reads, Sherry Ann Jarvis, March 9th, 1966, November 1st, 1980, with the inscription, "Forever in our hearts, never forgotten." Sherry's family visits the grave when they can make the journey from Minnesota to Texas. They bring flowers, sit in silence, mourn the sister and daughter they lost 44 years ago. They also thank the strangers who never gave up on Sherry, who visited her grave when she was still Jane Doe, who refused to let her remain nameless. Detective Thomas Bean of Walker County Sheriff's Office, who worked on Sherry's identification, remains committed to solving her murder. Discovering her identity has given us some positive leads that we're actively pursuing. He said, "We won't stop until we bring her killer to justice." Or Case 8. April Tinsley, The Monster Who Taunted a City, Indiana, 1988. April 1st, 1988. Started as an ordinary spring day in Fort Wayne, Indiana. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley was doing what kids do, playing outside, enjoying the freedom of a Friday afternoon when school let out early. She was a bright, energetic little girl with a smile that could light up a room, the kind of child teachers loved having in their classrooms and neighbors enjoyed seeing riding her bike around the neighborhood. April's family lived in a modest but loving home in Fort Wayne. Her mother, Janet, worked hard to provide for April and her siblings, creating a warm household despite the challenges of single parenthood. April was close with her grandmother, who lived nearby and often watched the children when Janet was at work. The family was tight-knit, religious, the kind of people who went to church every Sunday and said grace before meals. That April afternoon, April asked her mother if she could walk to her friend's house a few blocks away to play. It was a walk she'd made before, through a safe neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children played outside unsupervised without parents worrying. Janet said yes, reminding April to be home before dark. April grabbed her jacket and headed out the door, telling "Love you, Mom," over her shoulder as she skipped down the sidewalk. It was the last time Janet would see her daughter alive. When April didn't come home by dinner time, Janet became concerned, but not yet panicked. Maybe she was having so much fun she'd lost track of time. Maybe she'd stopped at another friend's house. But as evening fell and still no April, Janet called the friend's mother, only to learn that April had never arrived. She had never made it to her destination. Janet immediately called the Fort Wayne Police Department to report her daughter missing. Officers responded quickly, beginning to search the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen the little girl in the blue jacket. Volunteers from the community joined the search, fanning out through streets and backyards, calling April's name into the growing darkness. For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Police brought in search dogs. Helicopters scanned from above. Hundreds of volunteers combed through fields, abandoned buildings, anywhere a small child might have gone or been taken. Janet and her family waited at home, praying for a miracle, hoping against hope that April would be found alive. On April 4th, 1988, 3 days after April's disappearance, a jogger running along a rural road in DeKalb County, about 20 miles from Fort Wayne, spotted something in a ditch that made him stop. There, partially hidden by brush, was the body of a child. The jogger called 911, his hands shaking, knowing immediately that this was the missing girl everyone had been searching for. April Marie Tinsley had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her small body had been discarded in that ditch like trash, left alone in the cold and dark while her family desperately searched for her. The medical examiner determined she had been killed shortly after her abduction, meaning she had been dead while hundreds of people searched, while her mother prayed, while an entire community held its breath, hoping for her safe return. The Fort Wayne Police Department launched a massive investigation. They interviewed everyone in the neighborhood, showed sketches based on witness descriptions of a man seen in the area around the time of April's disappearance. They collected physical evidence from April's body, including DNA samples that would prove crucial decades later. But in 1988, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and investigators had no way to identify the killer from the samples alone. The investigation went cold. April's family held a funeral that drew hundreds of mourners, all grieving for an 8-year-old whose life had been stolen before it really began. Janet buried her daughter, struggling to understand how God could allow something so evil to happen to such an innocent child. Then, in 1990, something shocking happened. Residents of Fort Wayne began finding notes left in public places Scrawled messages on pieces of paper or cardboard, always in the same handwriting, always with the same disturbing content. The notes claimed to be from April's killer, taunting police, boasting about the murder, threatening to kill again. One note read, "Hi, honey. I've been watching you. I am the same person that kidnapped and raped and killed April Tinsley." The misspellings and poor grammar were consistent across all the notes, suggesting they were genuinely from the same person, likely April's killer. Over the next 14 years, more notes appeared sporadically around Fort Wayne. In 2004, the taunting reached a new level when several notes were found attached to children's bicycles and left on front porches in residential neighborhoods. These notes were even more explicit and threatening, describing what the writer wanted to do to other little girls. The community was terrorized. Parents kept their children inside. Schools implemented new safety protocols. Fort Wayne lived under a cloud of fear, knowing that April's killer was still out there, still watching, still threatening. The case became one of Indiana's most infamous unsolved murders, a haunting reminder that evil can strike anywhere, even in quiet neighborhoods on ordinary afternoons. Fort Wayne Police Department never gave up. Over the years, they re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, followed up on thousands of tips from people who thought they recognized the handwriting on the notes or had suspicions about neighbors or relatives. But every lead went nowhere. Then, in 2018, advances in forensic genetic genealogy opened a new possibility. The DNA collected from April's body in 1988 had been carefully preserved for 30 years. Detective Brian Martin, who had become obsessed with solving April's case, convinced his department to try the new technique that had recently been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California. The DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, where forensic genealogist C.C. Moore began building a family tree using genetic connections found in public genealogy databases. Moore uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a database where people voluntarily submit their DNA to find relatives and explore ancestry. The profile didn't match anyone directly, but it showed connections to distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared segments of DNA with April's killer. Moore began the meticulous work of tracing these family connections backward through generations, then forward through different family lines, trying to identify which descendant could have been in Fort Wayne in 1988 and fit the profile of April's killer. The work took weeks of intensive research, cross-referencing genealogical records with geographic locations and age estimates. Finally, a name emerged. John D. Miller, age 59, who lived in a trailer home in Grabille, Indiana, just outside Fort Wayne. Miller had lived in the Fort Wayne area for decades. He had been 29 years old in 1988, the right age to match witness descriptions of the man seen near where April disappeared. Investigators began surveillance of Miller's home, watching his movements, looking for an opportunity to collect his DNA for comparison. In July 2018, detectives collected Miller's trash from the curb on Garbage Day, a legal method of obtaining DNA without a warrant, since trash left for collection is considered abandoned property. The DNA from Miller's trash was analyzed and compared to the DNA from April's murder. It was a match. After 30 years, April Tinsley's killer had been identified. On July 15, 2018, detectives showed up unannounced at John Miller's trailer home. When they knocked on the door and Miller answered, they asked him a simple question. "Do you know why we're here?" Miller's response was immediate and shocking. April Tinsley, he confessed almost immediately, admitting to kidnapping April as she walked to her friend's house, taking her to his trailer, sexually assaulting her, and then strangling her to death when she tried to scream. He described dumping her body in the ditch where it was found 3 days later, and he admitted to writing the taunting notes that had terrorized Fort Wayne for years, saying he'd done it because he enjoyed the attention and liked knowing that people were scared of him. The news of Miller's arrest made national headlines. After 30 years of waiting, April's family finally had answers. Her killer had been caught. Justice, though delayed 3 decades, would finally be served. Janet Tinsley and April's extended family attended every court hearing, wanting Miller to see their faces, wanting him to know that April had been loved, that she had mattered, that she hadn't been forgotten, even though he had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a victim in his sick fantasies. On December 7, 2018, John Miller pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation charges under a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty, but ensure he would never walk free again. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a 59-year-old man. At the sentencing hearing, April's Aunt Teresa Tinsley read a victim impact statement that brought tears to everyone in the courtroom. April was a beautiful, innocent child who had her whole life ahead of her. She would have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, gotten married, had children of her own. John Miller took all of that away from her. He took our April and threw her away like garbage. We've lived with that pain for 30 years. Now he gets to live the rest of his life in prison, knowing what he did, knowing that everyone knows what a monster he is. April Marie Tinsley is buried in Fort Wayne, her gravestone bearing the dates March 31st, 1980, April 1st, 1988, and an inscription chosen by her family: "Forever ate, forever loved." After Miller's conviction, Janet Tinsley visited her daughter's grave to tell her the news. "We got him, baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We finally got him. You can rest now." The resolution of April's case demonstrated both the power of genetic genealogy and the importance of never giving up on cold cases. Fort Wayne Police Department's persistence over 3 decades, combined with cutting-edge DNA technology, finally brought justice for a little girl who had been failed by every adult who should have protected her on that April afternoon in 1988. Case 9. Stacy Lynn Chahorsky. The first double identification, Georgia, 1988. For 33 years, she was known only as Rising Fawn Jane Doe, an unidentified woman whose body was found along Interstate 59 in Dade County, Georgia, on December 16, 1988. She had no identification. No missing persons report matched her description. No family came forward to claim her. She was buried in a Georgia cemetery with a marker that read simply, "Unknown female." But Jane Doe was someone's daughter. She was someone's sister, someone's friend, someone who had once had a name and a family and a life full of possibilities. And for more than 3 decades, people refused to let her remain nameless, even though finding her identity seemed impossible. The case was unusual from the start because investigators had very little to work with. The woman had been dead for some time before her body was discovered, making visual identification difficult. She had no fingerprints on file in any database. There were no obvious clues to her identity or where she had come from. All investigators knew was that they had an unidentified female homicide victim whose killer had dumped her body alongside a highway in rural Georgia. Over the years, various investigators worked the case, each hoping to be the one who finally identified Jane Doe and caught her killer. Forensic artists created clay facial reconstructions, trying to show what the woman might have looked like in life. These reconstructions were shared with media outlets and posted in missing persons bulletins, generating tips that investigators dutifully followed up on, but none that led to identification. In the mid-2000s, advances in DNA technology created new possibilities. Evidence from the crime scene was sent to FBI laboratories for analysis. Scientists successfully extracted DNA from Jane Doe's remains and created a profile that was entered into missing persons databases. But there were no matches. Whoever this woman was, she either hadn't been reported missing or had been reported under circumstances that didn't result in her DNA being entered into the national databases. The case was reassigned to new investigators in 2015, who decided to try a different approach. They worked with GBI forensic artists to create updated clay renderings and composite sketches, incorporating age progression techniques to show what Jane Doe might have looked like at different stages of life. These new images were shared widely on social media and in true crime communities, generating renewed interest in the case. But still, no one came forward with her identity. Then, in 2020, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the FBI made a decision that would finally crack the case. They would use forensic genetic genealogy to identify both Jane Doe and, if possible, her killer. The case would become a test of just how powerful this technology could be. Evidence from both Jane Doe and from the crime scene, which contained DNA believed to belong to her killer, was sent to Othram Labs, a Texas-based company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. Othram technicians used advanced DNA extraction and sequencing techniques to build comprehensive genealogical profiles for both the victim and the suspect. These profiles were then turned over to FBI genealogy teams, who began the painstaking work of building family trees from genetic connections found in public databases. For Jane Doe, they traced family lines back through multiple generations, then forward through various descendants, looking for a woman who would have been the right age, had gone missing, and could have ended up in Georgia in 1988. In March 2022, the FBI announced a breakthrough. Rising fawn Jane Doe had been identified as Stacy Lynn Chahorsky, a 19-year-old woman from Norton Shores, Michigan, who had been reported missing in January 1989. The identification answered many questions while raising others. Stacy had been a free-spirited young woman who loved to travel, who had left Michigan to see the country, hitchhiking and taking odd jobs wherever she went. She had last been heard from in September 1988, when she called her mother from North Carolina, saying she was traveling to Flint and then Muskegon, Michigan. But Stacy never made it home. Somewhere along her journey, she encountered someone who would take her life and her identity, leaving her body beside a Georgia highway where it would take more than 3 decades to restore her name. Stacy's family in Michigan had never stopped wondering what happened to her. When she first disappeared, they filed missing persons reports and tried to track her movements. But the trail went cold. As years turned into decades, they began to accept that Stacy was probably gone, though they never stopped hoping for answers. We lost Stacy more than 33 years ago, and we've lived in bewilderment every day since. Her family said in a statement after her identification, "We want to thank all who have worked tirelessly to find Stacy and provide the long-awaited, albeit painful answers to our many years of questions." But the FBI wasn't finished. They still had DNA from Stacy's crime scene that was believed to belong to her killer. Using the same genetic genealogy techniques that had identified Stacy, they began building a family tree from the killer's DNA, looking for connections that might lead to his identity. In September 2022, the FBI held another press conference to announce an even more remarkable breakthrough. Stacy's killer had been identified as Henry Frederick Hoss Wise, a long-haul truck driver who had been 34 years old in 1988 and regularly drove routes that would have taken him through Georgia. Wise had a documented criminal history and had worked as a stunt driver before becoming a truck driver. Investigators discovered that he had died in 1999 in a car accident in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, meaning he would never stand trial for Stacy's murder. But at least his identity was known. At least Stacy's family finally understood what had happened. The resolution of Stacy's case made history. It was the first known instance where forensic genetic genealogy had been used to identify both a victim and a perpetrator in the same investigation. FBI Special Agent in Charge Carrie Farley called it extremely unique and incredible during the press conference. The investigation revealed that Wise had a living family member who was interviewed, cooperated, and a DNA match was confirmed. Farley explained. The family member's DNA had been the key to identifying Wise as Stacy's killer. Stacy Lynn Chahorski's remains were returned to Michigan, where her family held a funeral service more than 33 years after her death. She was finally laid to rest near her childhood home, her gravestone bearing her full name and the inscription, "Forever Traveling, Finally Home." At the funeral, Stacy's mother, now elderly and frail, placed a hand on her daughter's casket and whispered, "You can rest now, baby. We know what happened. We know who did this. You're not alone anymore." The case demonstrated the extraordinary potential of forensic genetic genealogy to solve even the most challenging cold cases. Cases where both the victim and the perpetrator are unknown, where decades have passed, where traditional investigative methods have failed. It gave hope to countless other families still waiting for answers about loved ones who vanished without a trace. Our Case 10. Janice Starr, the jogger who never came home. Pennsylvania, 1988. January 28, 1988, was a cold winter morning in North Huntingdon Township, Pennsylvania. But that didn't deter 30-year-old Janice Starr from her daily exercise routine. Janice was a dedicated runner who jogged several miles every morning before work, maintaining the kind of discipline and dedication that defined her approach to life. She was a wife, a mother, a valued employee at a local business, and a beloved member of her community. Someone who balanced all her responsibilities with grace and determination. That morning, Janice kissed her husband goodbye, reminded him she'd be back in about an hour, and headed out for her usual route through the quiet residential streets of their neighborhood. She wore her running shoes, a warm jacket against the January chill, and carried nothing except her house key. It was a route she'd run hundreds of times before, familiar territory where she felt safe and comfortable. When Janice didn't return home after 2 hours, her husband became concerned. This wasn't like her. Janice was punctual to a fault, always home when she said she would be. He got in his car and drove her usual jogging route, looking for any sign of her. When he found nothing, he called the North Huntingdon Township Police Department to report her missing. Police began searching immediately, following Janice's usual route, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her. They found her within hours, but not the way anyone hoped. Janice Starr's body was discovered in a wooded area not far from her jogging route. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Her body left in the woods like she meant nothing, like her life had no value. The brutality of the crime shocked the community. This was a safe neighborhood, a place where people felt comfortable letting their children play outside, where women jogged alone without fear. If Janice Starr wasn't safe on a morning run, who was? The investigation began immediately, with state and local police working together to process the crime scene and interview potential witnesses. Physical evidence was collected, including DNA samples that would eventually prove crucial to solving the case. But in 1988, DNA technology was still relatively new, and investigators had limited ability to use the evidence effectively. Janice's funeral drew hundreds of mourners. Family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, people who had been touched by her kindness and warmth. Her husband stood at her casket, struggling to understand how his morning goodbye kiss had turned into a lifetime of absence. Their children, still young, couldn't fully comprehend that Mommy was never coming home. The case eventually went cold, joining thousands of other unsolved murders in files across Pennsylvania. But Janice's family never gave up hope that someday, somehow, her killer would be identified. That day finally came in 2024, when advances in forensic genetic genealogy allowed Pennsylvania State Police to identify Janice's killer as a man who had died years earlier, never having been held accountable for his crime. The resolution brought Janice's family the closure they had waited 36 years to receive.